Well, Gish, first of all, I think I speak for all of us on this panel to say it's a real honor and pleasure for us to be here with you, especially I know for many of us who are Asian Americans, you are a living legend when it comes to
Nolly.
I should also say that most of you know Professor Singer, but to my right is Yvonne Hao, who is my wife. Oh, sorry, to my left, your right. Right? As you can see, better half, right? But one of the things I think Professor Singer and I have both learned is that we should always defer to our better halves to speak first. So I'm going to do that, and then Professor Singer and I will chime in after as well.
Thanks, Gish, and thanks for having me. So I have no reason to be here since I'm not a lawyer and have never been to law school. But I want to just first start out by saying, and so I'm very honored and grateful to be here. First, I just want to say, though, that the fact that I'm here and that I know Gish is proof that life is pretty magical. So I'll tell you how I know. I first interacted with, or got to know Gish. So I was a sophomore at Williams College. And I grew up as a first generation born in this country, immigrant family in Chicago. And so I went to Williams, and that year, for the first time, we had a professor teaching Asian American studies. So I signed up for the class, thought it'd be good to learn about my background. And in that class, I learned a lot of things that I wish I'd known earlier about the history of Chinese people and Asian Americans in this country. But also, that's the first time I read Gish Jen, a typical American. And I think in all of my high school, I had never read a book written by an Asian American, and not to mention an Asian American woman. And that book spoke to me in so many ways about things that I'd experienced growing up in America. And so I was always just thought she was the best. But then, flash forward many years later, I became a trustee at Williams, which is still very surprising to me. But I became a trustee at Williams, and we're sitting in the Honorary Degrees Committee talking about, hey, we need to figure out who to give degrees to this year to honor, and it's been a while since we had someone Asian American. Who do you know who's who you think would be so inspirational? And I was like, I actually know someone. I think we should get Gish Jen. And they're like, I think we know someone who knows her. So then through that, Gish was so generous to accept this honorary degree from Williams, and I'm on the board, so I got to meet Gish Jen / stalk her and tell her how amazing she is and how she influenced my life. And then it turns out she's a neighbor in Cambridge, and my daughters got to meet her, and now my oldest daughter, who's 10, is inspired by Gish to become a writer. So this all shows how incredibly magical. If you had told me at Williams that I would ever get to be sitting with Gish Jen at Harvard Law School, I would have said you're crazy. But anyways, having said that, Gish's book is funny because we got to know each other, and I told her how much I loved her work. And she said, I'm working on something new. I'd love for you to read it. And I travel a lot for work. You can read about it on one of your flights. And I said, oh, awesome. I love your fiction, and I want to read some more fiction. She said, actually, it's not really fiction. And she gave me a draft of this book. And I still loved it, even though it's not fiction. And actually, it brought to life, for the first time in a very articulate way, things that I've been thinking about a lot growing up, and then also being an adult here in America as an Asian American. It reminded me of 3 Chinese words. So let me just explain the words that I think are very much an imprint of who I am. And not until I read the book did it really kind of come to life. So one Chinese word is shaoxun. And for anyone who's Chinese here, shaoxun is beaten into you from the day you're born. Shaoxun means respecting your elders and being part of this filial piety thing. And so much so that in my family, from when I was a small kid, I was told by my mom that on my birthday, I should be giving my mom a present to thank her for bringing me into life. And that was raised in your book. And so so I did all that. I bought my parents a house when I made money. I bought them cars. This is what you do as a Chinese person. So shaoxun was one word. A second word, it's very important, is renqing. And ren means people, and qing is like feelings. And so there's this concept of renqing, which is that when someone does something for you, you have to repay it. You're kind of indebted. It's you have renqing, and you do this for this person because of renqing, and there's this connectivity, this invisible renqing that connects people. And I always was brought up being well, we have to go visit this person in the hospital because it's renqing. We have to repay them for whatever they did for us a million years ago. And then the third concept, which I really remembered a lot growing up, is these 2 words, ingai. And ingai is you must do it. It's and it's usually ingai is referred to you must do it because I know you don't want to do it. It's not something you're going to get any benefit out of, but it's your ingai. You have to do it because it's better for the group. It's better for the social good or whatever. And so these are things that were very much part of who I was. And then I became an adult and started working. So I graduated from Williams, thought I was going to be well, first my mom wanted me to be a pre-med because that's what, so I finally fought off that. And then I thought I was going to be a professor, but I wasn't smart as all of these people here. So, and then I thought I would just go into business to try to, earn some money to pay my parents back. So I've been in business. I went to McKinsey first, then I was at Honeywell, and I ran a division there. I ran a $2 billion business, and then I was at Bain Capital for almost the last 9 years, investing, being on boards, working with CEOs, stepping into leadership roles. And then in January, I just left Bain Capital to become the COO and CFO of a startup here in Cambridge called PillPack. So in business, I suddenly, for the first time, realized, wait a minute, like people in business don't follow these rules. Like there's not the same like respect for elders and hierarchy, this concept of Shao Swin. There's not this wrenching. Like I just did like this whole deck for this person, pulled an all-nighter, and then person barely thanked me and took all the credit. And wait, and there's not this concept of ingai, like why am I the only person like making photocopies like when everyone else is going to the meeting? Like, so I had to really adapt some and try to like understand more the world of the avocado pit. But I'll have to say, it's interesting is that now, as having been in business for a while, I fully subscribe to Gish's recommendation, which is I think the world is a better place when there's a mixture. And I'll tell you why. So in my role, one of the things I've done is I've been up close and personal with a lot of CEOs and a lot of companies. And I reflect on the best CEOs and the best companies. And culture is such an important part of that. And I think the worst CEOs are the ones where it's all about them. This is all about me. You serve me. Like I am the emperor, and like you are the people. And that is not inspiring. It doesn't create a great culture. It doesn't create long-term shareholder value. It doesn't help you grow. It doesn't create innovation. The best leaders, I think, are the ones who think about the group and think about reciprocal and what can I give you? How can I help you develop? How can I give you opportunities? But it's kind of a different way of inspiring people that I think the best CEOs are like that. And yesterday, actually, I was just in New Hampshire. For PillPack, we have 500 people who work there who are mostly hourly people, and I did a town hall. And I always say, do you have any questions? And so one of the questions was, I don't really believe what management says. Like, what do we think is really going to happen to the business? And I just stopped them and I said, wait a minute, I don't think that question's even the right question. Like this shouldn't be, there's management and there's not management. We're all in this together. And like when I'm like, technically like all these people report to me, but when I'm in a leadership role, I report to you. Like my job is to help make you more successful, and we are all like shareholders of this company. We all have to work together. I think that mix is just a much better approach to having great business success. The other context I will say that I think about Gish's work a lot is as a parent. So when I'm not working, we're trying to hopefully not screw up our two daughters too badly. But it's interesting because it comes up all the time, and how, after I read Gish's book, I realized and how we raise them. So for example, Mark's mom unfortunately has Alzheimer's, and she lives not too far from here. And we visit her often, and it's not pleasant visiting her. She's very, very difficult. She can be violent. She says really wildly inappropriate things. She often smells bad. It's a really unpleasant experience. And our kids will say, well, our friends have their grandparents who live there, and they don't visit their grandma or their grandparents that much. Like, why do we have to visit grandma? And we always talk about, well, like, this is our duty. Well, she raised your dad, and she took care of when you were young, and this is now our turn to take care of her. Period. Like that's what we do. That's like our family values. So that's something that we think about a lot in parenting. On the other hand, though, we also have mixed it with some of the big pit stuff, right? Because when I was a kid, it was very much like, you're going to take piano. You're going to do like, math class. You're going to do all these things. And with my kids, I'm much more, I'm not the tiger mom. I'm much more around like trying to figure out what they're interested in and helping cultivate that. And so it's kind of a mixture again of this big pit versus flexi self. So anyways, I just wanted to say this book resonated tremendously with me, and I'm so grateful for the book, but also for just being able to know you and come full circle from my Williams College sophomore year days. Thank you so much.
You realize that we are actually family. Yeah. That's my long-lost sister.
Well, I'll just add a couple of words on top of this. Gish, I want to thank you for introducing these concepts, because I think so often we talk about this tension between East and West, or individual versus collective, or social-oriented versus ego-oriented, and so forth. And I think what you've given us through these concepts of big pit and flexi self is a sense that these aren't so much tied to cultures or traditions per se, as they're tied to ways of seeing the world, and that there are Chinese who are big pit avocado types who march in and tell you all about how great they are, and there are Americans who, as astonishing as they may seem, are really sort of see things as part of a system. And I love what you talk about, how Tom Brady is emblematic of that, and then there are a number of Chinese who fall on the other side of it. And I think what's important here is that as the work that I do in terms of globalization, trade, and so forth, as these cultures interact with each other, that we start to understand how the other side sees it. And especially for those of us in the West who tend to see many of the excesses of the flexi-self system, and how you think, how could I ever operate along those lines? It's important to realize, I love the analogy that you used in the book, the rest of the world sees the U.S. as weird, right? And there's an acronym in the book as to what weird stands for, and that's the majority of the world. But these two will always have to be in some degree of harmony with each other as technology in the world brings us together, and it's about how each of us learns to cultivate these ambidextrous selves of ways of stepping into one mode or the other at any particular time. Now, I wanted to bring this to a little bit more of a personal sense, which is one thing for those of you who are thinking about whether or not to read this book. I think one thing that's interesting about this, especially for those of us who I think are Asian American, is oftentimes, right, we come off as being just as big pit, we're just as ego-oriented as anyone else out there, right? And so there are great anecdotes in the book for those of you who are law students. If you want to read about what Professor Suk Gerson's life was growing up, there are great anecdotes about that in the book, and how a lot of the big pit type is learned because of schooling, but it's also learned because of what's happening around your friendships and what's rewarded in terms of incentives in the system. But in some essence, what you're saying is these modes of being, while they can be trained one way or the other, right, they're still a core part of who we are. And it's important for others to realize that there is a flexi-self way of looking at the world. And I think when we reflect on, I mean, we did the test with our girls. They don't even know what all three of those words mean in Chinese because we don't use those concepts very often with them. We just sort of do it with them. And yet they were clearly flexi-selves, right? And it just gets ingrained. And I think when I think about which of my friends Yvonne complains most about, it's the big pit types, right? That really, so there is a mode of being that may not be apparent on its surface. And I think it's important, especially for those who go into the law, when you're working with your clients, to be aware about thinking about how they see pictures and how they look at it. And in some ways, there's a relativism to it, but there's also an absoluteness to it. And I think that's especially true in the legal system, which tends to reward big pit-like behaviors. And that's how you get ahead, and that's how you market, and that's how you promote. But really, in terms of getting things done, it takes some incorporation of the flexi-self as well, and some melding for whichever side you're coming from to adopt some of the skills of the other side while cutting off some of the excesses. So thank you for drawing all of this to life. And I hope many of you will choose to read the book and gain from its insights.
They're getting a kickback, you realize, on the sales.
So I just want to say a couple things, so some time for some questions. It's an absolutely brilliant book, both in the concepts that are discussed, but also in the way it's presented through stories. I mean, Gish is a storyteller, and it's a very intellectually rewarding thing to see the distinctions that she's talking about the savannah and the lion, and the ordinary versus the extraordinary, and the group versus the individual. And there's a lot of these sort of contrasts, but the stories are what actually give you a sense of what it really means, and just beautifully written and very fun to read. So let me just say two things. So I teach property law, and so I thought I'd say something about law, and the concepts in the book gave me a new way to think about some of the ways that Americans think about property. And there's one mode, which is to think about the land and the owner on the land and the relation with the owner and the land. And there's the unique individual who is powerful, and it's my land and nobody can tell me what to do with it. And this is actually a huge thing in the United States about how we think about property. Professor Lazarus just argued a case in the Supreme Court where there's some owners saying the zoning law doesn't let us do what we want to do with our land, and they're complaining about the government telling them they can't do what they want to do. And that's a kind of image about the strong individual who's against everybody. And then, of course, Professor Lazarus teaches environmental law. There's a completely other way to think about property, which is ecological, and it's just not your property. It's property among other owners, and it's property along a gorgeous river, which is very vulnerable. And if there's too much development along the river, we're going to lose this gorgeous river and also pollution and erosion and a bunch of other things. And so this image of property is being situated among other owners, and someone being a neighbor rather than like an owner. That neighbor image is actually just as American as the owner image. And being a good neighbor is a completely different way of thinking about ownership. The same thing, the community. Day after 9/11, Clarence Thomas's father-in-law put a American flag on the balcony of his condo, and the condo association told him to take it down because they had a rule: no decorations, no flags, no wind chimes, nothing. They wanted to have a beautiful exterior of the building, which was, just looked the way it looked without having flags and stuff like that. He was very patriotic. He was very upset about 9/11. He refused to take it down. The story got into the national news. And one image of that is this lone individual flying the American flag on his home. And Congress actually, in some sense, agreed with him. Congress passed a law 5 years later that said no condominium rule should be enforced in the U.S. if it says you can't fly the American flag. And so there's this image of him as this lone individual flying the flag. But then you have this other image of Congress unanimously passing a law saying the whole country needs people to be able to fly flags and come together in an emergency. And then you have the other image of he didn't buy a single-family home. He bought a condo. And a condo means you're agreeing that the majority of your neighbors can pass rules about what happens. And so a completely different version of it is, what matters is he was a neighbor in a community that makes rules. And he was sort of saying, I'm more important than everyone in the community. But actually, Americans like homeowners associations. There's lots of them. People, like being in those communities. Some people hate it, but some people really like it. And so rather than being this heroic individual, in some sense, he's being this, this person who's defying the norms of the community that he's in. I just want to say one other thing about music. I'm a musician, and the chamber music example is incredibly evocative for me. I've been playing violin my entire life, and maybe I'm a big pit guy in the sense that I'm not afraid of making mistakes. So when I play with friends, I usually am playing first violin. There's first violin, second violin, viola, cello, and string quartet. I don't care about making mistakes, and so I'm usually the first violin part is a little bit harder than the second violin part. I can play it. Partly I'm good enough, and partly I don't care if I make a mistake. But I have a lot of experience playing that, and the string quartets, to play that kind of music, every voice is incredibly important. Every single voice matters a lot. When I'm playing first violin, I try very hard to listen to all four voices. It's hard to do. The first violin has the melody, usually. Not always, but often. And it feels like you and everyone else. And then when I got tenure at Boston University, my wife's present to me was a viola. So I taught myself viola, and I learned how to play viola, and I learned the viola clef. I started playing the viola part. So it's first violin, second violin, viola, cello. Cello often has the bass note, which is often the foundational note of the chord, not always, but often. The viola often has the third. So if their chords 1, 3, 5, 8, 3 is often the note that makes it major or minor. The viola part is unbelievably important in terms of creating the character of the music. And I started playing viola on string quartets, and I had this incredible experience that playing the viola part made it much, much easier for me to hear all four parts. Playing the first violin part, it felt like me and everyone else, even if I'm trying as hard as I can to listen to each individual voice and fit with everybody. But as a viola, I found it much easier to fit and to sort of hear other people and to be able to be a good team member. And so I had this other experience of playing viola, and it's like these completely different experiences. And the first violin part feels like the independent person, and the viola feels a lot more like a team player. And I now have the incredible experience of being able to play the same Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven string quartets, and I can play 3 of the 4 parts. And so I play the same music over and over and over and over again, and it's different every single time, but I also can experience from a completely different perspective, and the viola part just gives me this feeling of being part of a group much better. That you can do this with first violin, but it's hard, right? So we'll stop there.
God, it is so much fun. I have to say that, I don't know, this is totally stereotyping, but when I was an undergraduate, I always thought that, like, lawyers were really boring. And law school was the last kind of school I would ever want to go to. And sitting here, I'm thinking, like, oh my God, this is the most interesting thing. And even though I have been in the world of art and literature my whole life, I swear this is the best panel I've ever been on. It's really terrific. And that's something I think that we'd like to take some questions from you, if any of you have some. Liz.
This was wonderful, Gish. I really enjoyed it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you think people become these rather essentialist types. So we have a case here of Yvonne, who considers herself Asian American, and yet she grew up in a household where she was being taught very different values and expectations. So what is the process? We've heard some about schooling, heard some about the law. Obviously, the media is a factor. But what's the process when, the American hardly exists other than perhaps in Trump's imagination, in that people have very complicated stories that are often mixtures of cultural influences. So are these just ideal types that in fact really don't exist in any real way, but are aspirations or stereotypes? Or in fact, do you think that there are institutions that reinforce them?
I think they're absolutely institutions that reinforce them. So the answer is that, what I'm trying to put forth is really a framework. So this is just like saying, feminism. Feminist lens is a helpful lens sometimes, but it's not always helpful. Is there an actual woman that that we're talking about when we're talking about feminism? Very hard to say. At the same time, it's a useful lens. So I'm just trying to say this is a useful lens. I don't know that you would ever meet any, as I try to say, most people have both selves kind of latent in them. So I don't know if you would ever meet someone who was flexi self all of the time. That said, it's very much tied up with culture. And culture is something, it's both something that you will inherit from your parents, often, way before you're aware that you're learning anything, right? So it's very interesting to me that, so here you're looking at Yvonne and Mark, growing up in the United States, completely functioning in the United States. Their children are still, are showing that Chinese culture. And of course, your children were me. So I also, I grew up, as you know, in Scarsdale, New York, not far away from you. In every way, I seem just like all my classmates. And yet, it really wasn't until, I was in my 40s, well, I guess my 30s, that I began to realize that actually, despite the fact that I am completely like my classmates in some ways, I'm not. And I think that's to say that, I have to say that my parents were not so traditional. So I did not grow up with, a lot of these ideas were there, but they were in English. My parents were very progressive, so they didn't really emphasize them that much, but they were there. And I can see now that it's not actually even just what the parents say, but very basic things like how much they held the child. And I myself, I think the first inkling that I got that maybe that, my Chinese side was still there was when I had my first child, Luke. And the first time I was in a mother's group, and the first thing that happened is everybody took their baby and they put the babies on the floor. And I found that I physically could not, this is a hardwood floor. I could not put my child on that floor. So we were in the circle, and everyone else put their child on the floor, and I'm holding my child like this. I just couldn't do it. And then we went around the circle, and every mother said, well, what do you want for your child? And every mother said, I want my child to be independent. And It got to me. I'm like, independent? These kids are a month old. They can't hold their, didn't even they're breastfeeding. They can't hold their heads up. So I said I wanted my child to be happy, But that was the first inkling that, actually there was something about the way that I saw child rearing that was not the same as, as my peers. And what I see now, the things like just literally how much body contact there is a big factor in what kind of self people will grow up to have, kind of foundationally, right? And so and you will see that the amount of touching in Asia, it's just like there's just a lot of touching. They're very comfortable with that. People from other cultures go. You can either feel like, whoa, this is way too much touching, or like, wow, this is really lovely. I mean, I really just my mother has been in the hospital, and recognize, I think, in a way that I maybe didn't recognize myself before I had written my book. I just thought, I know what my mother would like, and I put cream. I did her nails. I put cream all over her, including on her belly, and she was so happy. I mean, I can't even tell you. I mean, she so needed that. And so a lot of this stuff is very foundational. That said, there's a lot of societal infrastructure also. So you have maybe base tendencies that get set down by these kind of practices. A lot of them are how the child is spoken to. What do you spend all your time asking the child, what do you want? Do you know what I mean? And reassuring them that really the world is going to provide them with what they want. Or do you bring your child up, with an understanding of what they need to contribute in order to be what in Chinese thought is like a real person. So it's kind of like, what does it mean to be a person? And the answer is to be a person is to contribute, so that very foundationally you are teaching them from day one, what are you going to give? How are you going to contribute? Just these kinds of things, what is your duty? The kinds of things that Yvonne was talking about. But besides those voices, of course, we have all the social voices, right? The voices in Scarsdale, New York said very, very different things, and you internalize those too. And, when I think about, well, how internalized are they, well, you would have to argue that my novel writing self is definitely an acquired self. In other words, that's not a self that came down to me through my mother. And yet, at this point, if you ask me to stop writing, that would be like cutting off my arm. Do you know what I mean? In other words, so the answer is some of our acquired selves are also, it sounds like it's not really you, but it is really you. So I think it's very complicated. But the amount of social reification, I mean, it is everywhere, from the shape of the tables, to the size of the tables, to when you eat lunch, to who you eat with. It is absolutely everywhere. It's in the single-family house, right? I mean, it's in the car. It is in every single aspect of society. So I don't think that you can really live in another society without being altered pretty deeply. That said, as many an immigrant will tell you, you can be altered. Like 85% of you can be really quite changed as a result of having moved to another country, for example. And yet, there is going to be a foundational part. And believe me, I wrote Mona in the Promised Land. I was the original anti-essentialist writer, right? I mean, I wrote all those books, all those anti-essentialist books. So I know it sounds very essentialist, but I do think that it's at some level, some of these ideas are laid down very, very early, that they're coming to us via thousands of years of culture. It's not so easy to get rid of them. And very interestingly, actually, I saw a book that Mark and Yvonne's daughter wrote, and in it, you see a big bad wolf sort of figure who, sure enough, sees the error of his ways. It's a very flexi self narrative. And I think, interestingly for me, I'm second generation, and I'm looking down at the next generation. And what's so interesting is that even though I have said none of the traditional Chinese things to my children, and I mean zero. And my child is here, she can tell you. All I have ever said to them is, have fun. And yet, to a kind of uncanny degree, they're kind of on, kind of the good Chinese child, I hate to embarrass you, program. I mean, it's kind of, they are very high achieving, they do all the right things, and I never told them to do any of them. So it's kind of interesting, like where did they learn that? And the answer is, I don't know myself, but I can see it, and I know it's that others can see it as well. So anyway, that's a long answer. The answer is really complicated, really complicated. Other questions? We probably have just maybe time for one more question. It's 1 o'clock, I see.
I'm curious to know whether you have any thoughts about what the implications might be for the way people deal with mental health issues.
Yeah, absolutely. There are huge implications for mental health issues, obviously. Well, I think starting with the fact that, when we think about, we have all these models of what it means to be healthy, right? And for instance, we talk about people who have a flexi-self. We use that word enmeshed. Like if you go to a psychologist, they will say, oh, these people are enmeshed. And that is a bad thing. Like that is something that you have to kind of somehow work your way out of. But I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. Is it, you know what I mean? Like, why, where do we get that idea, right? That's wrong, right? In fact, the individualism is embedded in all of our practices. For example, in France, which is far less individualistic than we are, as many traditionally Catholic countries are less individualistic than we are. In fact, they have very little ADHD in their kids. It's like, it's like 1% or 2%. The percentage is very low. Where here we have lots of ADHD. Now, I don't believe the kids in France are not, they're not better behaved than our kids. It's not that. It's what people see when they look at the child. Right? So when psychiatrists here, they look at the child, they say, there is something the matter with this child, and we must medicate. And they're given drugs. In France, they look at the same child, and they say, there is something the matter with this kid's environment, and they look at the family, and they work with the whole family and the school. So it's the same thing, but the lens with which it is viewed is very different, and I'm sure that's right down the line, right down the line. So I do think that, every psychologist, needs to be very careful, in my view, with what they're bringing to the patient and whether they're bringing it, whether it's in the patient and this is really, they're helping the patient be the healthiest person that the patient can become, or whether they're simply trying to somehow bring them along some path which is really their own path.
And can I add one word there? I think it's really interesting now as America becomes a more multicultural society. Yvonne alluded to the fact that my mom is sick, and one of the things she's dealing with is mental health issues. And you can really see it in terms of the way they engage, right? It's a whole question about what happened to her, what is she like, how do we create an environment around what she wants to do? Whereas I think for us, it's very much how do we create a system that will help change this to bring out a certain type of behavior now that she's no longer cognition of everything that's going on. These sort of render themselves even more strongly. And so I think it's just really interesting to hear you say that. Gish.
Yeah, exactly. You're looking at the savannah, right? It's like you've got to change the savannah. And the answer is
going to work with her.
For her, changing the savannah really is the answer. I'm quite certain. And but you're right. Our mental health professionals are not oriented that way.
I wonder, though, if there may be a dark side to the flexi-self's approach to mental health issues because of the concern for the community and for possible reflection on the community. The person who has a flexi-self mentality may be less willing to seek help for mental health issues because that will be taken as a reflection on, parents or community not doing their job. Because I think that we have certainly seen that in our work with students.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that I don't think there. Both selves have pluses and minuses. I think that really, I think when we think about selves and whether they're good or bad, I think that we really need to think about whether they're adaptive or maladaptive, right? That's really the bottom line. And I think, but you're absolutely right. I think people who come from a flexi-self background, because they're very aware of how they're seen by any outgroup, and the idea that, yes, that anything that they say about their unhappiness can reflect badly on their whole constellation, their whole family constellation. You're right, they tend not to go seek help. And then it's also true that that the ones who seek help may actually feel the kind of dissonance that Mark and Yvonne are describing, and then it just kind of underscores that, there's kind of no going there anyway, right? Because it's so kind of culturally insensitive. So I would say that, yeah, there's a very, very large problem there. Other questions?
I'm curious about going on the mental health issue and how you think it might affect immigrant populations. Sort of, if you are an adult coming here, it's very different from if you were a child growing up here. And if you're an immigrant coming from a place where community is extremely important, and then you come to the United States where you don't have any more community, you don't have your place in the community. Many immigrants experience this where all of a sudden the child is the one that navigates the greater world for you. And I was wondering how maybe you thought that implicated, these sort of, pit self versus flexive self, and how people might be able to adjust to the whole new framework of their society.
Well, I think the answer is, of course, it's very hard to generalize about all immigrants. But, I will say that one of the many things that you see is that not only is the child in charge, but the child is acquiring a big pit self, and that makes the child even more powerful. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's not just that they speak English, it's that they have a self that is functional, fully functional in America, where the parents may or may not have that self. I don't know and I'm not sure there's any answer to that exactly. I guess my hope is that just by having a framework, by having words for it, at least people can have some idea of what's happening, and that will maybe soften it to some degree. But if you ask me, is it very traumatic for many people? Of course, it all depends on the circumstances under which you came and how much community you managed to bring with you and so on. But, if we were to generalize about people coming from very strong communities, coming to the United States is really quite a shock. And I think in terms of Asian Americans, it's really been masked by the fact that people have done so well academically and so on. So they seem to be doing just fine. And by some measures, but I think, maybe by some other measures, I think this is just incredibly difficult, and really just excruciatingly painful in a day-to-day way, in a way that's really not much recognized.
I think we have time for one more. We want to give them time to sign books too.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I was just curious if you see the type of selves changing as China changes and modernizes and there's more private industry.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Of course, the flexi self is more associated with traditional agricultural societies, although obviously it persists because here we are. We don't live in an agricultural society and have never done any farming, and yet we still have this self. So obviously it does persist. And the answer is, I think we see a lot of persistence, especially in East Asia. So if Thomas Telhelm at the University of Chicago does this beautiful graph, where if you graph sort of rising GDP and modernization against individualism, in a general kind of way, as you become more modern, the societies tend to become more individualistic. But very interestingly, East Asia has been a big exception. Yes, it has become more individualistic, but not as fast and not as much as other countries. We could be here all day discussing why that might be. Partly it is kind of the cultural reinforcements that Liz was talking about. I have to say that the Chinese were the masters of of culture and how to make it into a system. They were the masters, and I think that that's one of the reasons that you do see the persistence of this flexi self in Asia. And the other factors are simply the fact that it's very crowded there, right? But you do see a persistence if you say, well, how do we know that it's persisting, right? Well, Thomas Telhelm just did an experiment just last summer in Shanghai. Actually, it was only part of his experiment, but anyway, part of it was in Shanghai. What he did was he went to 100 Starbucks throughout the city, and he put the chairs in such a way that they were really very inconvenient. So you could get through those chairs, but you would have to turn your body and kind of sidle through this way, So the question is, in the West, confronted, if you did this on Mass Ave, people are just going to move those chairs, right? They're in your way, you move them. The question is, well, what percentage of the Shanghainese move these chairs? And so we're talking about last summer. We're talking about, a very westernized city. We're talking about a very westernized population within that westernized city. We're talking about a very wealthy westernized population within that very westernized city, right? And the answer is 1.9% of the people move those chairs. And the answer is, so yes, they are somewhat more individualistic than maybe they were, but those numbers are very different than what we would see in the United States. And I will say, by the way, very different than what you see in northern China. Northern China, which is historically wheat growing rather than rice growing, actually the numbers are much higher, close to 20%. So, and that's one of the many interesting things when we talk about cultural persistence. It is very fascinating the way that, agricultural practices, on which obviously a population depended, they're tied to survival, how those practices really shaped the culture and the selves that became predominant in those regions. And those selves and that culture has remained amazingly persistent. The Chinese, if you go to China, they talk about it day and night. Actually, they don't really talk about us very much. All day long in Shanghai, oh my God, the northerners this, the northerners that, there's people in Beijing. And you go to Beijing, it's the opposite. Oh my God, in Shanghai this, in Shanghai that. I mean, it's like when they think about marrying out, it's like, oh my God, my daughter is is dating someone from Beijing. The disaster.
And actually, I would just say that I see that in business as well. So going to do business in China and Japan, you're in a business setting, so it's industrialized, whatever. But there's just a lot of differences that emerge. So you still see, in China or Japan, where I spent the most time, where if you say, hey, here's where we want to go, we need you guys to do this. Like, it's okay, great. The company needs us to do this, we're going to go do that. And they just go do that. In America, it's like, what's in it for me? Like, am I going to get promoted? Am I going to get more money? Like, let me argue with you about why I can't do that. It's just a very different mindset still. And, it's changing, and it's individual, and these are broad generalizations, but there is a difference still in how people even do the same thing, which is business, right? So it's interesting.
Yeah, and how many people have to be thanked, right? My husband always says that in America, you have to thank every single person who had anything to do with anything. In Asia, it would be like, why are you thanking everyone? But on that note, I think maybe thank you all for coming.
Thank you.